Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gina Smarecki. I am the events manager at Newspire, and I'll be your host for this live session. Happy Tuesday. In celebration of 2/22/22, we will be giving away free lunch or rides to Uber to 10 lucky registrants, so make sure to watch your email. I will be notifying the winners via email in the coming days. Today's webinar is one of our most popular each year as we look at Newspire's Q4 threat report findings and the full year in review for 2021. We're excited to share insights on the current trends in cybercrime. Also, the full threat landscape report is available to download from our website, and so I'll share that link in the chat box for you. Please submit any questions you have to today's presenters in the questions tab on the right side of your screen. We'll collect all of your questions and address them at the end. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Josh Smith and Justin Hurd. Josh is a cyber threat analyst at Newspire who works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curating threat intelligence and authoring Newspire's quarterly threat landscape report. Josh is currently pursuing his master's degree in cybersecurity technology. Previously, he served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of service. Josh has been quoted in Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures, Dark Reading, and others. And Justin is our manager of threat intelligence and works to develop and deliver intelligence at Newspire. Justin has over 13 years of experience in cybersecurity and has developed methodologies and tools for industry-based threat modeling. Justin previously worked 6 years for a defense contractor as a security engineer and network administrator. And now I'll turn it over to Josh and Justin.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Certainly appreciate you taking time out of your days to come in here and take a look at the things that we discovered over Q4, as well as kind of take a full look at the year 2021 with all the data we've collected and trends we've seen. So kind of a quick overview of what our agenda is going to look like. We will look at each data set from Q4 as well as a year in review, and then follows up with a proactive how you can mitigate against those sorts of things. We'll have different sections from malware, botnet, and exploits. And then once we wrap everything up from there, we'll tie it all up with a nice bow of conclusions and recommendations.
I can start us off here with methodologies and overviews. Again, thank you for joining us. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how Newspire treats threat intelligence in the different sections we work through. And a lot of times, this is how we come to the conclusion of some of the data that comes into this report. So the first and foremost, we gather the intelligence. Those are from multiple sources where we can collect intelligence, open and closed source, our own data and research. We process the intelligence. So it's very important for us to go through all the intelligence that we collect because there is a lot out there. Figure out what's good, score it, analyze it, and get it ready for our detection methodologies. And those are going to be things like SIM notifications, alerts that we can get via email, SMS, for acting on the intelligence that we create. The second to the last part here is the evaluation stage. And basically what we're doing here is we're going through the intelligence and figuring out what the audience is for it. Was it useful in the detection of what we were trying to find, which moves us into disseminate. And from here, we are disseminating the threat intelligence. The quarterly threat report that we're doing here is a good example of that. But we also do some SAT news, which comes out via email, and then disseminating throughout our organizations in the organizations that we work for.
So as we jump right into the next section here, what we're going to take a look at first is our malware that we witnessed throughout Q4 of 2021. So in comparison against Q3, we saw about a 4% decrease. We still witnessed over 1,000 unique variants. This broke down to roughly about 270,000 detections per week and about 38,000 per day. So when we look specifically at our top 5 malware detections, one of the things that has continued to dominate here is Visual Basic for Applications agents. They continue to capture a very large part of the malware category. What this really tells us is phishing is still a very, very real threat for organizations. If you're not familiar with what these VBAs are, we're going to jump into a slide right after this part that we're going to get a little bit more in depth about what they are. But ultimately, those are those macro-based files you see come into your email. That's the Word docs and the Excel files. And they have some form of a lure attached to them to try to get the user to enable those macros. Ultimately, cybersecurity awareness training is still one of your best bangs for your buck to really go ahead and tackle phishing threats and ensure your users are very aware of what's going on out there. So as I mentioned, we're going to jump in and talk a little bit more about these VBA agents. We actually saw a 28% decrease in VBA agent activity compared against Q3. Typically, we see these attacks come in waves, though, as these threat actors, they launch these campaigns. They may have a specific holiday or a specific news event or something like that they've built all their theming around. So we'll see these attacks start to kind of spike up around that time frame. When we see these decreases, usually what that's attributed to is we're seeing retooling. They're either pulling back and they're creating new versions of their malware to try to be able to get around signature-based detection, or they're maybe just updating and refreshing their phishing templates to try to now jump to whatever the current trending event or upcoming holiday is. This type of malware, as I mentioned before, is typically seen with the Microsoft Office, Excel, and Word documents, trying to get someone to enable those macros. If they're successful in getting the person to do so, these run a malicious script. They reach out to somewhere and pull down a second stage loader, something like Emot or TrickBot or a ransomware family. And from there, it'll begin to infect the system. Depending on what the nature of that malware is, it can do multiple different things, from whether that's ransomware and encrypt all the systems on a network, whether that's to exfiltrate information out, or whether or not the threat actor just wants to persist in the network at the moment. Some really good news, though, that came out is that Microsoft announced that they're going to be disabling these VBA macros by default across all of their products starting in Q2 of this upcoming year. This can really cut down on a very significant attack vector right now. As we've mentioned earlier, too, these VBA agents are really highly utilized right now. There's a statistic floating around out there that right now about 25% of all ransomware attacks are launched via these VBA agents. So it's a really, really good thing to see Microsoft go ahead and jump in and make it much more difficult to enable these. We jump forward into looking at ransomware activity. From Newspire's perspective, we didn't witness a whole lot of ransomware activity with the exception of a large spike within November. One thing we did notice, though, is throughout 2021 in general, ransomware operators faced intense law enforcement collaboration of law enforcement during 2021 that we've really never seen before. Gangs like the Dark Side Ransomware, they were the ones that are attributed to the Colonial Pipeline attack, basically came out and said, there's just too much pressure right now, and they quit. Another operators out there, REvil or Revil, depending on your pronunciation of it, those operators were really arrested in late December by Russian authorities. So ultimately, what does that mean? I think that we'll see a shift in ransomware targets. And right now, these operators are very financially driven. They want to make money. They don't want to end up in jail. So ultimately, they're going to shift their targets away from the quote unquote big game targets, the major organizations that are going to become a widespread nation headline if they are breached. That's also your government organizations, things that will draw the attention and ire of law enforcement. So I think what we'll see here is a shift really to much more small and medium style businesses. They're still going to be able to seek payouts there, and maybe it may not be as large of a ransom as before, but it's still money, and they're staying, hopefully, in their eyes, out of the target and crosshairs of law enforcement.
Yeah, and to reiterate Josh's point here, I really think that this crackdown from law enforcement agencies will show us a decrease in ransomware activity over the course of the year here. I think Josh mentioned retooling. That will be something that we'll continue to fight against. One thing that we can do on the defense side is try to focus more on the techniques. I've worked quite a few incident responses where we're dealing with ransomware, where a lot of times the techniques and tactics used by the attackers are the same. If authorities start cracking down on ransomware in certain vectors, they'll certainly retool and find other ways to install ransomware. I think overall it will result in a decrease in activity. But for us to stay vigilant and proactive, we need to focus on the different tactics and techniques that they're using in order to get these ransomwares installed and then execute them across the network.
So we take a look at the entire year of 2021 when it comes to malware activity. Ultimately, compared to what we witnessed in 2020, activity was down by 9%. The most active month that we witnessed was the month of May. We'll see a full breakdown on the next slide of the top different variants. But ultimately, as we mentioned before, these malicious macros and phishing files have pretty much dominated the entire year. So these are the top 5 variants that we witnessed. With that being said, 3 of those variants were these VBA agent flavors or varieties. And then other than that, we saw malicious HTML and JavaScript variants. Threat actors are trying to utilize these to bypass email security and antivirus and hoping, again, to entice those users to execute those macros and run these malicious JavaScripts and then pull down the payload at that point. Can't stress enough here again about user awareness training. And then hopefully what we'll see here with the announcement from Microsoft taking action against these is that we'll hopefully see a big decrease in VBA agent activity as we move later into 2022 and those updates are rolled out.
So to talk a little bit about the mitigations that we have for the malware families and some of the things that we discussed here, endpoint protection, EPP, those are really good at helping us detect the different types of behavior that some of these malware families exhibit. Network segregation is very big, trying to limit the amount of surface area that an attack can get to. And then ultimately, cybersecurity awareness training. I know we talked a lot about this. Anywhere where the user is the vulnerability that's being exploited by the attacker, user awareness is going to be our best tool for defending against that. It's not as straightforward as deploying an endpoint or deploying a firewall in order to stop something, but it is very important. Microsoft is kind of helping us with the removal of the VBA by default, which kind of helps us with users potentially unwittingly starting these macros that have hidden intentions or downloaders inside. So that'll continue to be a very good method for us to mitigate some of these threats when it comes to the malware families that we've been seeing.
We move into our next section, taking a look at botnets here. So as we look at botnets, we witnessed overall a really large drop in activity compared against Q3, about a 57% decrease in activity. Ultimately, we saw 39 unique botnets. That breaks down to about 60,000 detections per week and a little under 9,000 detections per day. Of our top 5 detected botnets that we saw throughout Q4, Zordos was one of the botnets that we saw had a huge amount of activity within Q3. One of the largest quarters we had seen of that botnet being active. So that kind of skews our numbers a little bit as we're going into Q4 due to the really significant amount of activity we saw there. While I would still say compared to our normal baseline, if you will, we did see lower activity in Q4. That 57% becomes a much larger number when we come down from that peak of activity from Q3. Andromeda botnet is another one that continues to dominate, as well as Torpig. Those are some things that we see consistently within our threat reports, and really aren't going anywhere. Their baseline activities pretty much remaining the same. They're still all very active, though. Something that's really notable to speak about, though, is specifically the Emot botnet. Early in 2021, everybody in the security teams gave a big sigh of relief as we heard law enforcement had shut down one of the most notorious malware and botnet families that's probably existed. As of November of Q4, threat intelligence started to be shared throughout the community that Emot was back, it's rebuilding. And after that, we started to look at our Q4 data, and we witnessed an increase in Emot activity throughout. This activity is not nearly as significant as what we saw of Emot in its prime, but ultimately we do see that activity building again. So as we move through 2022, I would expect we're going to start seeing a lot of activity again from Emot as they continue to recapture that market space, if you will. And it's something to keep an eye out on their tactics, techniques, and procedures.
Yeah, and I think that generally the use of botnets, the utilization, the different types of tactics and techniques are used by botnets will continue to make this prominent throughout, pretty much every year. There's going to be a lot of activity from botnets, from DDoSing to command and control to control specific malware families. So we'll continue to see this increase of botnet and this use of botnet. One thing about botnets, it is one of the easier things for us to detect through threat intelligence. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this in the mitigation section here. But anything that's easy for us to detect is usually easy for the attacker to change. So while it's not completely useless to try to detect some of those things through the use of malware IPs or botnet IPs, it is not the only way to be able to detect these different botnets in the network when we're looking for them.
As we jump over and we talk a little bit more about the Zordos botnet, as I mentioned before, it gave us really a lot of significant activity in Q3. As we moved into Q4, that activity dropped off into basically no detections afterwards. It's an advanced family of denial of service. They can sell those services out to other malicious actors if they want to perform denial of service attacks against a specific organization or target. They also do utilize this botnet to perform brute forcing attacks, and they basically are out there scanning for exposed services. If they detect something that's exposed, say there's an open SSH port, they'll attempt to brute force it. And if they can gain access to it, they'll add those devices to their botnet to continue to build. With that, it appears ultimately that at the moment, these guys have gone back into hibernation. This isn't the first time we've ever seen this in the past. We've seen them pretty much cease doing activity. And because of this, though, this is what caused that vast notable decrease in overall activity for Q4. What they're doing right now is the moment. We don't have any collaborating intelligence of why they've hibernated. But typically, as we mentioned before, a lot of times it's due to retooling. It may be something that they're doing upgrades or code changes to their software. And I have no doubt that we'll see them again at some point in the future. So we take a look at the entire year of 2021 versus 2022. We saw an overall negative 4% decrease. The most active month being September, which was with Zordos activity. With that too, and some other things that may attribute to why we saw the decrease is ultimately with Emot being shut down at the beginning of the year. Emot was really busy during 2020, and so with their activity missing, we saw that decrease. These botnets, though, overall, they're spread via phishing. Through an infection where they reach out to the command and control and are added to the botnet there, or like I mentioned a little bit before too, with these exposed services. These different families all have different goals. Ultimately, they all just want to capture more devices though to add to the network. So we look at the top botnets overall though for 2021. Andromeda botnet was one of the most active that we witnessed, with Zordos and Zero Access being very closely behind it in activity. And again, as we move into 2022, I really am expecting to see Emot catch back up and capture some more of this, again, market share, if you will, when it comes to botnet activity.
So when it comes to mitigation and response to botnets, we talked about leveraging threat intel a little bit earlier, using all of that information we have on known command and control servers that's shared throughout the cybersecurity world, using next generation antivirus to try to detect the activity or anomalies based in traffic that is in line with botnet activity. DDoS is a good example of that. And then threat hunt, using the information that we have about command and control infrastructure and going in and checking the data that we have to see if we have activity of that or we've ever seen activity that is related to botnets.
So we jump over into our last section here of exploits. Overall, we saw a decrease in activity here as well, too. We saw about a 45% decrease when we look at comparison against Q3. There was 566 unique exploits with over 1.6 million exploits detected per week, with over 228,000 attempts per day. We look at our top 5 exploits. SMB brute forcing has continued to dominate, as well as we see SSH brute forcing is another thing with that too. We take a look at something like double pulsar, for example. That's a really older exploit, but still something we're still seeing being utilized because it's so powerful. And I think that's something to note, that it's not always just about the new, brand new exploit that's been announced. You need to ensure all your systems, especially the things that are utilizing maybe an older Windows suite or server suite, are also patched and being maintained to those legacy systems. There are threat actors out there that are still seeking to exploit those and looking for those types of vulnerabilities. Another thing too that's very interesting, the Apache Log4j. I'm sure a lot of folks have all heard that within the headlines at this point. But with just really, I think it was 21 days within that last month, with December of the quarter, the amount of activity that we witnessed during that time frame still pushed it into 5th place of the top observed exploit attempts. And so we'll jump into SMB brute forcing and Log4j here in the next few slides. So something that we've noticed here, or that we've witnessed here, is that SMB brute forcing really, once again, has dominated throughout Q4 to the point of where 51% of all of the exploit attempts that we witnessed throughout Q4 were specifically driven by this. So this is really, I think, a big wake-up call, and I hope administrators will take a look and understand, what is your digital footprint? What do you have exposed out there? And if you have services exposed, should you have those exposed, or do they need to be secured behind a VPN or something of that nature? Ultimately, the moral of the story is, if you have a service exposed to the internet, someone is going to scan for it, and if they find it, they're going to attempt to breach it. If it has a login attached to it, they're going to brute force it. They're going to try to break the door in at that point. There are numerous malware families, numerous botnet families out there that are all looking for these exposed services, and will just sit there and attempt to brute force inconsistently or a steady stream until they finally kick the door in and can get into a specific system. So we look at Log4j. This was announced in December 2021. When this announcement came out, this is one of the largest in vulnerabilities that we've seen in recent history. This open source product, it was utilized in numerous software. So it really got a lot of administrators scrambling out there to say, does the particular software I use have this a part of it? Are we using this within our server stack? And ultimately, I do think the cybersecurity community at large did respond really well about getting information out very quickly. So a lot of people jumped and were able to get a lot of the patches and things put into place. If your organization is not, it's something you need to take very, very seriously. Threat actors are very actively seeking out this vulnerability and looking to abuse it. And the reason why is because they can create reverse shells, They can take over the system. They can add it to their botnet. They can deploy ransomware, ultimately whatever it is that they want to do. But the big thing to drive home is, threat actors almost instantly, when this vulnerability was announced, begin seeking out these vulnerable devices and attempted to exploit them.
Yeah, to add to that, a lot of the investigations that we've been a part of rely on these exploits that are old or announced that have been used, or that can be used for them to get a foothold into the network. A lot of times, not just Log4j, but other unpatched systems that are out there are just easy targets. And I think the attackers will continue to target these low-hanging fruits to try to get access into the network, which can lead to ransomware, data exfiltration, and a lot of other things that we don't want on our networks.
So we take a look at the entire year of 2021. When we compare that against 2022, we only saw about a 13% decrease in activity. And the decrease that we witnessed is really attributed to a decrease in SSH and SMB brute forcing compared against 2020. This hopefully correlates to what we're seeing as organizations are discovering these exposed services that have been opened up, like during the rush of forcing folks into remote work during the COVID era of 2020. A lot of administrators, made changes almost immediately to be able to support their workforce as these folks were now, pushed out of the office and working from home. That exposed a lot of things that maybe it was more of an operational need to get that up and running, regardless of what the exposure was. And perhaps now that the dust has settled a bit on those sorts of things, we're starting to see some of these services secured and less exploit attempts against that. When we look at 2021 overall, though, again, brute forcing is something that we saw dominate, and really cannot stress enough to everyone listening in organizations everywhere. Make sure you understand your footprint and you secure your exposed services. Something Justin mentioned a couple slides ago too, I feel it's a good thing to bring back up here again, is threat actors ultimately, I feel, are very motivated by low-hanging fruit. They ultimately are looking for the biggest bang for for the littlest amount of effort they can put into it. They're looking for these big vulnerable devices that are out there where, hey, there's already these proof of concepts that have been released. They can just gather all that stuff up and just start scanning services out there on the internet till they find something that's vulnerable and then go ahead and jump into it. One of the things that we did for the last quarter review as well, when we looked at things like proxy logon and proxy shell, if you're familiar with the tool Shodan is basically a Google, if you will, of all the devices that are out there in the world. You can literally get into it and search for a specific service. You can search a specific IP address. You can search by vulnerability even. It will give you a list of all the things that it's discovered. This is something anyone can jump onto and look at. And you better believe threat actors are also utilizing that to just get a giant list of devices. In Q3, when we looked at that, there were still over just like 20 or 30,000 devices that were exposed to like proxy logon and proxy shell. So what I'm trying to get at is low-hanging fruit is very attracting to them. And ultimately, sometimes, even if these threat actors have even the slightest bit of resistance against an organization, there's still some organizations out there that are so easily to get a hold of, they may just move on because it's not worth their time and effort.
So exploit mitigation and response, I think we harped on this a little bit. Patch the systems as soon as possible. As soon as there are mitigations or patches available for those systems, recommend using the vendor's instructions to patch those systems. I think one thing that's forgot about are old servers that are just kind of hanging out that no one uses anymore. We see a lot of times that those are vectors for attackers to get in, and the administrators never knew that they existed, or they forgot, or they were there before they came. So just going through and having a good inventory of the systems that you have, what they're used for, what software may be present on them is another good thing we can do to try to mitigate these types of attack and ultimately reduce our attack surface. Firewall with intrusion prevention system is very nice for detecting exploits that we see happening, web type of exploits or log4j signatures. The firewalls can help stop some of that traffic, or at least let you know that it's going on so we can take further steps. Monitoring security news and vendor security bulletins. We here at Newspire, we do a security news that goes out just to let people know what's going on as far as security patches, trends, and things of that nature. Also disabling unused services. So this kind of goes with the, finding the devices that are hanging out on the network that may not be needed. Same with services. So limiting the services that you need on that particular system and getting rid of the ones that you don't need. Josh mentioned that SSH and brute forcing is a big thing. So if you don't need SSH exposed for a particular system, don't allow access from a network perspective. And then, you can stop it a little bit further up the chain before it gets deeper into the network, where we have to rely on other mitigation strategies to catch different types of attacks.
So as we go to wrap this up, we'll move into questions and answers right after this section here. But just kind of want to highlight everything that we just talked about here again. One, educate your folks. If you don't have a cybersecurity awareness plan and training within your organization, to me, in my opinion, it's one of the biggest bangs for your buck that you can possibly get. Ultimately, they are the last line of your defense if something reaches them. They're the human firewall, if you will. And if they're able to identify something suspicious, malicious, or an attack that's going on, they can report those things to the proper folks within your organization. That's another really important aspect of that too, is do your folks know where to report that at within your organization? Is there an established policy there for that? Are they going to lean over to their coworker who may not have any form of cybersecurity training more than they have and ask, hey, does this email look sketchy? Or do they have an actual help desk or an IT, security staff member that they know that they can reach out to and how to get a hold of those folks to have them take a look at their stuff? Need to take a layered approach to security. No matter what you get, there is no one single technology anywhere that will completely secure your environment. That's why we want to have the multiple layers of defense. I like to try to think of it as a bunch of nets. If you cross all these different nets up, they're going to, close the little gaps and holes within each other and hopefully catch everything. Ultimately, though, there is never one specific thing that will secure your entire network. So you need to have things all the way through it, from your firewall level all the way down to the endpoint to your end users. Continue to apply your patches. It's very easy for me to say as a security personnel, hey, make sure you apply all those patches. But I do realize and understand that there's organizational balances in production time and things of that nature. This is why you need to understand the criticality behind specific patches and understand through using threat intelligence and what the vendor themselves are recommending. Is this a no joke critical, going to be nasty vulnerability, or is this something on a lower priority that can wait until your normal scheduled patch windows? Making sure you're subscribing to those vendor bulletins, as well as tracking threat intelligence, can help you make those decisions within your organization and understand how much risk you really are taking in by waiting or pushing that patch off, or whether it's really all stop, we need to apply this patch as soon as possible. Updating your malware protection. It sounds simple, it sounds silly in a way, but ultimately, it's one of those things that if you're not keeping your things updated, whether that be one, using legacy only signature based stuff and not moving into heuristics and behavioral analysis, or literally the signatures, the update signatures on the software as well too. You're only as good as your last update. And you want to make sure you're also segregating your high risk devices. Justin spoke about it earlier about network segmentation, specifically things too, like your Internet of Things devices that have that one firmware that was installed on them when they first came out of the box, and no one's touched them in the past 4 years, and numerous vulnerabilities have now been discovered for it. you want to make sure you're segregating those things. So if they are infected, it really limits where the threat actors can spread and where they can go. But ultimately, that wraps it up for Justin and I, and we can shift over into some Q&A.
All right. Thank you both for a great discussion and presentation, sharing your intelligence. I did want to, I know we're a couple minutes over here. If everyone wants to hang around for Q&A, please do so. If you have to run, we will send out the recording of this as well. So you will have that to refer back to. But I did want to make sure we did address a couple questions that came through on the chat. So there was a question, I believe this was covered on a slide, but if we could go and review it one more time. Was there a year-over-year increase in malware?
I don't have handy, at least at this moment, what the 2019 numbers were. I can say from 2020 to 2021, we did see a decrease. My gut tells me without looking at it that we saw an increase from 2019 to 2020 and then a decrease from 2020 into 2021. But I unfortunately, I just don't have the 2019 numbers in front of me ready to go to be able to answer that.
Oh, no worries. I'm sure we could dig back to our threat reports if needed.
Yeah, we can dig it up.
Someone from the audience, thank you for your question, John. So he was asking specifically about the threat report, if it actually says how the data was captured. And I think we touched a little bit on the methodology there. Do you guys have any other information there?
Yeah, ultimately, I think what John might be asking, though, is kind of where the data itself came from. And so this comes from all of our client devices that we have, all the different logs. And ultimately, it's roughly over 1 trillion logs per quarter. So it is a lot of data that we do collect. It's from different endpoint logs, firewall logs, all collaborated within our SIM, and then being able to generate the reports from that data.
Awesome. And does it give that information in the report at all?
It does. In the top of the Q4 report, it does give a section about the data itself and how we collect it.
All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? I don't see any more at this time, so I'm going to move on, but I'll keep watching it. Just one last announcement here. So Newspire is conducting a research survey to collect information on how our audience defines XDR, or extended detection and response. So we'd love to hear from all of you. I will go ahead and share the link to that in the chat box in case you want to participate. And then I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But if anyone does have any other questions, please email us at webinars@newspire.com or contact us through our website at newspire.com. Everyone will receive a follow-up email with the recording. And as always, stay tuned for invitations to our upcoming events. Any closing thoughts from either of you, Josh or Justin?
No, ultimately, thank you everyone for attending. We certainly appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend it with us.
All right. On behalf of Newspire and our presenters, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.